know it's important, and we know that community engagement can really actually have some beneficial outcomes in this, but scope creep, non-core business, is something that is increasingly on the radar. It's perhaps not so much of an argument against community engagement per se in principle, but it's probably a threat to the frequency of engagement and the nature of the issues that will canvass, or the idea that we as professionals and council workers are only interested in keeping their job. This is not just about the idea that we think this is a nice thing to do and we think, you know, emotionally and morally this is a responsibility that we as a council should be doing. There's actually some really hard factors and some data that supports the idea that this stuff works. And so I encourage you to seek those out. Well, some people believe, well, you know, community engagement is an abrogation of my responsibility. You know, I have a statutory responsibility to make decisions. I get paid to do so. Why would I set up an alternative process which allows me to deduct the responsibilities in my office, and as I've been empowered by the Local Government Act, I'm going to go forth and do it? Well, I think the answer there is, it's not always easy to talk to these people in these terms, but to be an effective leader, community engagement is really a champion of change. I mean, there's no point having a really firm vision, a really firm idea about where you want to go, very convinced that this is the right thing for the community and goddamn it, you're an expert. But it's no good striking forth and having absolutely no one realising why we're doing what we're about to doing, and you can go a long way down the road before you look behind and realise that there's no one following you at all. So I think in terms of the abrogation of responsibility argument, we're paid to make these decisions. I think that's really the angle that you sort of need to take. Look, we understand, yeah, it's a great idea. However, we've got a responsibility, as was pointed out earlier by Gary, that realistically we work for the community. And so I understand that you've got some certain professional things that you need to get out, but nonetheless, you will be better served by engaging in greater community engagement. The next one, which is kind of similar in a way, this is ego. I'm a goddamn professional. I'm a subject matter expert, 27 years of experience, I've got a master's degree, the secondary research in this area is strong enough for me to have really robust evidence-based policy in this particular area. So why would I ask the people, next slide, what the hell their opinion is? The idea is to compete against the other teams to build the tallest tower you can possibly have that's freestanding and can support the marshmallow at the very top of it. So anyway, everyone dives into it. You can see the different ways people work in teams, individually, whether they're engineers or whether they're more socially involved and all the rest of it. But consistently, and it's been run hundreds of thousands of times all over the world, consistently the responses are that primary school kids outscore MBAs. Community engagement is often seen as discretionary spend, and you can read that as unnecessary spend. Sometimes it's seen as a nice to have, not a must have. And I've got to admit, this is a really tough challenge to overcome. It's hard in a resource-constrained environment in which rate capping is about to become a reality. It's difficult to know that realistically high-quality community engagement is not necessarily a cheap exercise. But typically what the bean counters are looking for, or the more conservative CEOs, is return on investment. You know, what are we going to get out of this? How's this going to save me downstream? And leverage of fixed and sunk costs. So everyone in this room draws down on a salary. It's no good having the intellectual horsepower but also the capital investment in you and not actually have it leveraged, not actually have it out there working, not actually be out there producing results. It's like building a community centre but not having any tenancy of that particular area. So that I find is probably sometimes can be a powerful argument. It's basically say Ginian examines the difficulty in qualifying subjective outcomes. So participatory budgeting might be an example of this. Might be a potential weakness in some areas, where a decision of one group of people can be completely different to the decision making and the form of outcome of a different group of people, but there's no way to actually measure the relative merit. You know, what makes this better than that? How is that quantifiably a better outcome? You can have two groups, different outcomes, both equally good, and there can be a great many combinations of good. The defence to opinion is really about increasing transparency. You know, we know transparency improves the quality of opinions and decisions. And it's also about having engaged community groups and individuals actually being let into the tent where they can piss outwards rather than the other way around. But rather than us as professionals say to them, look, we understand that, competing community interests and all the rest of it means we can't do it, that's not going to be good enough for them because you're just blocker. So sometimes it can be good to say, you know what, fantastic idea, let's put it to the test, I'm going to invite all these other interest groups and you can pitch the idea to them. And be very surprised, or probably not so surprised, to see how quickly they can sort of realise, oh, maybe this is not a robust, or maybe this is not a community accepted norm. It also introduces the idea to some single issue people, and sometimes this can extend to councillors, that there are actually competing interests and ideas out there. Alluded to earlier, this stuff is sham consultation, predetermined outcomes designed to tick boxes and make people feel like they had some sort of influence over the outcome. You've got to take the time to prosecute the arguments and bring people along with you. You've got to understand that in many ways, community engagement is a very significant cultural and business process shift from the old centralised command model. So don't be too dismayed if you come along this sort of resistance, that if you have certain initiatives that perhaps aren't backed, over time, these things will certainly start to change. So feeding the chickens is definitely something that informs some of the senior decision makers about whether or not this is a valid exercise of council funding. It's starting to feel a bit like David Letterman. Numbers, sample size and representation. Does this initiative hold statistical weight and validity? Poor engagement, it really hurts future applications and future ask. There are a lot of examples that I've seen, both in my own council, but also around the traps, where it's just too small a sample. Who cares if 47 already civically engaged, usual suspects squeaky wheels turn up to inform your transport strategy? It's like, yeah, whatever's. If you've got 180,000 residents, or 200,000, or even 12,000 residents, is this actually statistically significant for us to say this is definitively driving a more robust representative solution? I think setting KPIs to manage expectations can be really important, particularly when you're dealing with the hard-to-reach minority communities, at-risk communities, in which low turnout or low engagement is often a consequence of a multitude of different factors which are really hard to manipulate. So just be really upfront with what they can expect to sort of get out of it, because internally, mentally, they're making up their own mind about what constitutes success. Now, that might be a million miles away from what you think constitutes success, particularly if you've got an insight into the difficulty perhaps of engaging with certain groups. So put those targets on the table and make sure you reach them. Where outcomes are considered foregone conclusions, or at least they're asserted to be. This is kind of a favourite hobby horse of the jaded. I bet I can tell you what they're going to say. You will have all heard that. I mean, it is quite arrogant, it is quite patronising, but where there can be relatively unsophisticated community engagement that doesn't cast that net further past those usual suspects, it can be proven to be true. That having an evidence base to support assertions made internally can only bolster a council position. So even if they actually do get it right, even if they've got a really firm conviction that they know how this is actually going to play out, and some of these guys have been around for a long time, they've got a lot of experience, they know their own communities and all the rest of it. So it's not to dismiss, maybe their assertions. Sometimes they're well founded, but it's the harm in going out and saying, guess what, you're right. That's just that idea that we're going to bring in an independent third-party review. Because if it is quite a big community issue, if it's an issue that there's quite a lot of community approbation or concern, or the idea that there's quite a lot of money being sunk into this particular item, sometimes there can be a reluctance to be able to front the press or negative proponents and say to them, well, we, in conjunction with our community, came up with this solution. You know what, it's a really great ass-covering exercise if you can sort of say, well, we had this reviewed by an independent third party and Ernst & Young came in and their proposal, because somehow that's more legitimate than working with our own communities.